April 15th, 1912, 12:35 a.m. Captain Arthur Rostron is asleep aboard the RMS Carpathia. She's steaming quietly east across the North Atlantic, with New York behind her and Europe ahead. She's not fast, and she's not famous, and she's not particularly large, and she definitely has no reason to become part of the most famous maritime disaster in history. Then, someone pounds on Rostron's door. They report that the Titanic had been struck by an iceberg and she requires immediate assistance. Our reported position is over 58 miles away. Rostron gets up and, before he's even completely dressed, gives the order to turn the ship around. Only then does he ask the wireless operator if he's certain. Now, think about that for a moment. Rostron doesn't confirm the message and then turn. He turns, then confirms. Because if the message is wrong, they've lost a few minutes. But if the message is right, they don't have a few minutes to lose. Harold Cottam, Carpathia's wireless operator, confirms it. Yes, Titanic is in trouble. So Rostron bends over his chart. 58 nautical miles. He knows immediately what that means. Carpathia is not a fast ship. At her normal service speed, they are hours away, and nobody knows how much time the Titanic has. They don't know whether she's just leaking, listing, disabled, or already sinking. They know almost nothing except that the largest ship in the world has hit an iceberg and is asking for help. So Rostron calls for his chief engineer. Another watch of stokers is ordered to the fire rooms, and every possible source of steam is redirected towards propulsion. And then comes the order that will define the next 3.5 hours. All possible speed. Not comfortable cruising speed, not company schedule speed, and not whatever speed leaves a nice cushion in the machinery. Everything the ship can give. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, another ship is dying. And 58 miles away, Carpathia begins to run. This is naked history. And today we're talking about the RMS Titanic. But we're not going to spend most of our time aboard her, because we already know the Titanic's story and how it ends. This episode is about the ship trying desperately to change that ending. The ship that probably couldn't get there in time, but went anyway. This is the story of the RMS Carpathia. Now, if Titanic was a floating palace, Carpathia was a floating Holiday Inn. Perfectly respectable and comfortable, useful, but nobody was standing on the pier whispering, "My God, look at that continental breakfast." Now, the Carpathia had entered Cunard service in 1903 and spent much of her career carrying passengers between Europe and America. She was roughly 558 feet long. Titanic, on the other hand, stretched more than 880. Titanic dominated the horizon, and Carpathia got you where you were going. And that difference is the entire story. History remembers Titanic for what she represented: luxury, ambition, technology, scale, and the confidence of an age that increasingly believed humanity could engineer its way around nature. Carpathia represented something less glamorous. She worked. She carried immigrants, tourists, families, and ordinary travelers. She was dependable. And on that night of April 14th, 1912, dependable was about to become far more valuable than glamorous. Titanic heading west and Carpathia heading east, and for days these two ships had been moving toward one another without ever having the slightest reason to care. And then at 11:40 p.m., Titanic met an iceberg. The collision itself wasn't cinematic. It was no enormous crash and no instant wave of panic. Many passengers actually barely even noticed. There was a vibration, a scraping sensation, and a strange shudder that ran through the ship. But below the waterline, the situation was catastrophic. Several compartments had been opened to the sea. Thomas Andrews, one of Titanic's designers, assessed the flooding and reached the conclusion that nobody wanted to hear. The ship was going to sink. Now, there were more than 2,000 people aboard, and there were not enough lifeboats for all of them. So, wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began calling into the night. CQD, SOS. Come immediately. We have struck an iceberg. The newest, largest, most celebrated passenger liner in the world was doing something nobody ever expected her to have to do: begging for help. Nearly 60 miles away, Harold Cottam heard her. Now, Cottam had been preparing to go to bed. There was no 24-hour wireless department aboard most passenger ships in 1912. In many cases, there was just one operator, and when he took off the headphones and went to sleep, the ship was effectively deaf. Cottam just happened to be still listening. Had he gone to bed earlier, this story changes. Instead, he heard Titanic, alerted the bridge, and within minutes, Rostron was awake and Carpathia was turning around. And then Rostron started issuing orders almost continuously. Lifeboats were made ready, and gangway doors were open, ladders were rigged over the side, and lights were prepared along the hull. Chairs and slings were ready for anyone too weak to climb, and doctors were sent to stations throughout the ship. They collected blankets, coffee, tea, soup, and stimulants to make sure that the passengers coming off of Titanic were suitably cared for. People gave up their cabins, and stewards were awakened in preparation for the mass people that would be arriving. And Rostron did all of this before he knew exactly what they were going to find. He didn't know Titanic was actually going to sink. He didn't know whether they would arrive to find 2,000 people crowded on a crippled liner, or whether they would need towboats, transfer passengers, treat hundreds of injuries, or search open water. So he prepared for all of it. At the same time, deep below his feet, another part of his order was being carried out: speed. Now, this is the part of Carpathia's story that gets flattened by the phrase "Carpathia raced to Titanic." That sounds easy. Push the brass handle forward and cue the swelling music, and the ship goes faster. Now, steamships shockingly did not work that way. Steam had to be made, and speed had to be made, and that required men. Another watch of stokers called into the fire rooms. Men who should have been resting went below into heat. Coal dust, smoke, steel, and noise. Furnace doors opened, coal went in again and again and again. Above them was an ocean cold enough to kill a human being in minutes. Down below, men were sweating beside fires hot enough to make the steels around them feel alive. Rostron wanted every ounce of steam the ship could provide, and the engineering department set about giving it to him. Carpathia began accelerating beyond her normal service pace. Contemporary accounts differ over exactly how fast she ultimately went, but the exact decimal is less important than what everyone on board understood. They were pushing her, and they were pushing her hard. The engines hammered, the hull vibrated, steam pressure stayed high. Coal vanished into the furnaces shovel by shovel while the ship strained forward through the darkness. Every additional revolution mattered because speed was not really what those men were producing. They were producing minutes. Every extra knot shaved a little time from 58 miles of ocean. And somewhere ahead, people were already running out of exactly that. Now, 58 miles, that was the problem. Even pushed hard, Carpathia was still hours away, and nobody knew how many hours Titanic had left. That's what makes the rescue run extraordinary. They weren't racing toward a rescue that they knew they could make. They were racing toward one that they probably couldn't. And that's part of the reason why we're telling this story today. If someone tells you people are drowning 100 yards offshore, of course you run, but what if they're miles away? What if you suspect that by the time you reach them, the worst may already be over? What if helping them means putting your own ship at risk? Do you still go? Rostron did. And he did not merely go. He drove Carpathia toward the limit of what she could give him. There was no guarantee anybody would still be alive when they arrived. No guarantee Titanic would still be afloat, and no guarantee Carpathia herself would make it safely through what lay ahead. Because Rostron knew something else. Titanic had just struck an iceberg. which meant he had just ordered his ship to make all possible speed directly towards ice. And this is where the story becomes almost absurd. Rostron knows that there is ice ahead, not theoretically and not because of some warning received 12 hours ago. He knows because the ship he is racing toward had just been mortally wounded by it, and yet he still orders full speed. His solution is not to pretend the danger isn't there. He doubles the lookouts. More men go forward, and more eyes scan the darkness. Everyone on the bridge understands the gamble. If he slows down, people may die before he arrives. But if he doesn't, he could put the Carpathia into an iceberg and create a second disaster. Rostron has more than 1,000 people on board his own ship, and he's responsible for every one of them. And yet still, Carpathia drives on. And then they begin to see ice. A berg appears ahead and the helm turns. Carpathia swings around it, straightens, and pushes forward again. And then another. Turn, clear it, straighten. And then another. The North Atlantic that night was dark and unusually calm. There was no moon and little surf breaking against the bases of the bergs to help reveal them. Lookouts had to search for faint outlines, reflected starlight, subtle changes in the darkness, anything that might betray thousands of tons of ice directly ahead. So when somebody sees one, the wheel moves, the ship turns, and they clear it. Then the engines are asked for everything again. And this happens over and over and over. Arthur Rostron was a deeply religious man, and when he later looked back on that night, seamanship alone did not explain it for him. He knew exactly what had to be done. He had driven a passenger ship at forced speed through the same field of ice that had just destroyed Titanic. One missed sighting, one berg hidden in the wrong patch of darkness, one turn ordered a few seconds too late, and the rescue story becomes another shipwreck. Later, Rostron would say he believed that the hand of God himself was on the Carpathia's helm. And you don't need to share his faith to understand why he felt that way. He knew the margins and he knew how many bergs they had passed. He knew what one mistake would have cost, and yet the ship kept slipping between them. Turn, clear, full ahead, again. If Rostron believed somebody else had been holding the wheel with him that night, it was because he understood better than almost anyone how close they had come to needing a rescue themselves. Now, while Rostron watched the eyes, Harold Cottam remained at the wireless set. At first, Titanic was still talking. Messages came through, women were being put into the boats, and the engine room was flooding. Come quickly. Then the messages became shorter and more urgent. And then there was nothing. Cottam called again, but he received no answer. He called again, and still nothing. Now imagine that silence aboard Carpathia. Nobody has to explain what it might mean. The ship you are racing toward was transmitting minutes ago, and now she isn't. But Rostron doesn't turn around. The stokers don't stop shoveling, and the engineers do not ease the machinery. And the lookouts stay at their posts. They keep going, because silence does not necessarily mean everyone is dead. Not yet. At roughly 2:20 in the morning, Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Carpathia, however, was still coming. And this is the moment that I want to sit with, because we normally tell the story from Titanic's deck. We watch the bow disappear, the stern rise, that guy hit the propeller, the ship go down, and then we move to the rescue. But aboard Carpathia, there is no dramatic cut. Nobody says you didn't make it. They don't know. The stokers are still shoveling. The engines are still pounding, and Rostron is still on the bridge, with lookouts staring into the bleached dark. The doctors are prepping, stewards are still collecting blankets, and coffee is still being made. Every person aboard Carpathia is working toward a deadline that had already passed, and they just don't know it. And somehow, that makes the effort matter more, because the outcome is not what makes it courageous. They tried without knowing whether trying would matter. And then, low on the horizon, Rostron sees a light. A green light. It isn't Titanic, it's too low, but it is something. They answer with rockets and continue toward it. More ice appears, another course change, and another berg. By now, Rostron is searching for something enormous, for funnels, electric lights, a ship nearly 900 feet long. Titanic should dominate the horizon, but there's nothing. Just darkness, ice, and faint signals from somewhere ahead. Then, smaller pieces of ice began scraping along Carpathia's hull. Now, imagine hearing that sound after everything you know. The warning, the distress calls, Titanic stopping answering. Ice was physically grinding against your own ship while you continue forward. Finally, a little after 4 in the morning, Carpathia reaches the area of search. Daylight is beginning to bleed into the sky, and Titanic isn't there. But then they see a lifeboat, small against the ocean, moving toward them, and there are people aboard, alive. Ladders go down, and the rescue officially begins. Eventually, Titanic's 4th officer, Joseph Boxall, reaches Carpathia, and Rostron asks the question that has been hanging over the ship for hours. Where is Titanic? He's informed that she's gone. She's sunk. Now, imagine Rostron in that moment. For 3.5 hours, you've pushed your ship harder than normal, called men out of their bunks into the fire rooms, driven into an ice field, risked your own passengers, and listened as the wireless went silent, and searched the horizon for 4 funnels. And now somebody stands in front of you and says that you were too late. Titanic is gone. Then you look over the side, and there are people in that boat. So no, not entirely too late. One lifeboat becomes another, and then another, and then another. As daylight spreads across the ocean, more of them appear, tiny boats scattered across an enormous sea like stars in a pitch-black sky. Suddenly, every order Rostron gave 3 hours earlier makes sense. The ladders, the lights, the doctors, the blankets, the soup. Carpathia doesn't need to be a rescue ship. She already is one. Survivors begin coming aboard. Women, children, men, some injured, some nearly frozen, some wearing whatever they had managed to pull over their nightclothes before leaving Titanic. And many of them are searching for faces around them. Because surviving the sinking doesn't tell you whether your husband survived, or your wife, or your father, or your mother, or your child. Every approaching lifeboat brings another little bit of hope. Maybe they're in that one. It reaches the ship and the faces appear, and you don't see anyone. So you wait to the next. By about 8:30 that morning, the last survivors had been brought aboard. Roughly 700 people are still alive, but more than 1,500 are gone. Rostron couldn't save the Titanic. He couldn't save the people who entered the freezing water, and he couldn't erase 58 miles of ocean. But those 700 people had somewhere to go because Carpathia had come. And this is where we need to go back below deck. We remember Rostron, and we should, but Rostron gave the order. Other men had to physically turn that order into motion. For hours, stokers and engineers forced Carpathia forward. Every shovel of coal became heat. Heat became steam, and steam became pressure, and pressure became revolutions. And those revolutions became speed. And that speed became minutes. There's popular myth that the Carpathia was pushed so hard during the rescue run that her machinery was permanently affected, and she never again managed quite that same speed. It is a powerful image, but the historical record doesn't let us state confidently that as fact, but we don't need to. The documented reality is already extraordinary. The American investigation concluded that Rostron pushed Carpathia to her very highest limit of speed. Now, think about what that means from the investigation team. Not very metaphorically, not very emotionally, mechanically, they stated that the Carpathia had been pushed to her absolute limit. And that ship had limits, and that night they were pushed toward them because of 58 miles away, people might still be alive. Every turn of the screws brought less exposure to the cold, a little less drifting, a little less time before daylight, and a few more minutes in which somebody might hold on. Nobody below deck could see the lifeboats. They couldn't see Titanic. They weren't being cheered on by the survivors. They shoveled because the bridge had told them someone needed help. And for hours, that was enough. Once the rescue was complete, Carpathia turned west, back toward New York. The ship had left carrying her own passengers, was returning with hundreds more, and the world waiting. News of the disaster had spread in confused fragments. Some earlier reports suggested that everyone had survived. Others suggested the Titanic was still afloat, and families crowded shipping offices while newspapers printed whatever information they could get. On April 18th, Carpathia entered New York Harbor in the rain, and thousands waited, but before Rostron brought his own ship to Cunard's Pier 54, he made one stop at the White Star Line's pier. There, Carpathia unloaded Titanic's lifeboats. I don't truly know if you can invent a more haunting image. The largest ship in the world never reaches New York, but her lifeboats do, hanging from the little ship that went looking for her. And then Carpathia moved to her own pier. The gangways come down, and the survivors step ashore. Now, 6 years later, Carpathia returned to the Atlantic under very different circumstances. The First World War had turned passenger routes into war zones, and liners became transports moving through waters hunted by German U-boats. On July 17, 1918, Carpathia was sailing west of Ireland when she was torpedoed by U-55. 5 crewmen were killed, and the surviving passengers and crew abandoned the ship. And then Carpathia sunk. And there's something painfully fitting about her ending. 6 years earlier, lifeboats had rowed toward Carpathia, and now her own boats were pulling away from her. And there's no enormous mythology built around her, no century of movies and documentaries. She simply worked until she couldn't anymore, and then slipped beneath the Atlantic. Today, her wreck rests thousands of feet below the surface, and unlike Titanic, she is not a household name, which seems unfair, because one ship became famous for failing spectacularly. The other deserves to be remembered for trying spectacularly. Now, there is a version of the Titanic story where Carpathia is basically an epilogue. Titanic sinks, the survivors wait, Carpathia arrives, rescue, New York, roll credits. But that skips the most important part. Carpathia didn't just arrive, she ran. For 3.5 hours, a modest Cunard liner was pushed toward the edge of what she could give for people her crew had never even met. Below deck, men fed coal into furnaces until speed itself became nothing that they could measure but in shovelfuls. Engineers kept pressure high and lookouts stared into the blackness for ice. Stewards gathered blankets and doctors prepared makeshift treatment stations. And on the bridge, Arthur Rostron kept pointing his ship toward the place where another ship had already been destroyed. They knew there was ice and they kept going. They saw the ice and they kept going. Titanic had stopped answering and they kept going. The chances of reaching her before she sank were disappearing with every minute, and yet they kept going. By the time Carpathia arrived, the ship was gone, but the people in the boats weren't. And that's the part of the story that gets me. Nobody aboard Carpathia knew whether any of this was going to matter. The stokers didn't know, the engineers didn't know, Cottam didn't know, and Rostron didn't know. For all they knew, they were exhausting themselves and pushing the machinery to an absolutely punishing level to reach an empty patch of ocean. And they did it anyway, because there was a chance, a slim one, that someone might still be waiting. And apparently for Arthur Rostron and the people aboard Carpathia, that was enough. 58 miles in a ship that wasn't particularly fast, in an ocean full of ice, with one order: all possible speed. Maybe Rostron was right. Maybe there really was a hand on that helm that night. Maybe it was extraordinary seamanship, sharp-eyed lookouts, exhausted engineers, sweating stokers, or an unbelievable amount of luck. And maybe, depending on what you believe, those aren't mutually exclusive. But whatever carried Carpathia through that ice field, human beings still had to make the decision to go. And that's why I think Carpathia belongs beside Titanic in our memory. Not beneath her, but beside her. Because Titanic shows us what happens when confidence collides with nature. Carpathia shows us what happens when people are capable of doing afterward. You may not be able to stop the disaster, you may already be too far away, and you may know before you even start that the odds are terrible. But go anyway. Push, shovel, turn the wheel, keep the engines going, and get there. Because somewhere in that dark, there might still be somebody waiting for you. Titanic gave Carpathia everything that she had left. A position, a distress call, and a chance. And Carpathia gave her everything she had in return. Thank you for listening. I've been Dylan, and this has been Naked History. Thank you for working with me. I'm excited to get hopefully more consistent uploads in the next couple of weeks, now that we've gotten everything with the music sorted out. But as always, until next time, keep asking those questions, keep pulling at the loose threads, and every once in a while, remember the ship that wasn't supposed to be the hero. A little workhorse 58 miles away, running through the dark at all possible speed. Have a good one, and we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.